You've noticed them. The profiles with no face, the accounts with landscapes instead of selfies, the people who exist in your contacts but remain ghosts on your feed. And maybe, just maybe, you've wondered what makes someone choose invisibility in an age that worships exposure. This isn't about shyness. This isn't about having nothing to show. This is about something far more interesting, far more essential to understand if you want to grasp what's really happening beneath the surface of our digital lives. Because while everyone else is performing, curating, and broadcasting every moment of their existence, there exists a growing population who have made a different choice entirely. And that choice reveals something profound about power, identity, and what it actually means to be sovereign in a world that demands you constantly prove you exist. Let me tell you what psychology has discovered about these people. And more importantly, let me show you why their refusal might be one of the most psychologically healthy decisions being made in our current moment. The first thing you need to understand is this: sharing photos on social media is not a neutral act. It never has been. Every image you post is a negotiation with an invisible audience. Every selfie is a question waiting for an answer. And that answer comes in the form of validation, measured in hearts and thumbs and little digital affirmations that your existence matters. The people who refuse to play this game have recognized something crucial. They've understood that the moment you enter this exchange, you've agreed to a contract. You've agreed to let others define your worth. You've agreed to let the response determine the value of the moment itself. You've agreed to live in a state of perpetual performance, where your private experiences become public property, open to interpretation, judgment, and approval. This is what psychologists call external locus of control. It's the psychological state where your sense of self-worth depends on forces outside yourself. And social media has turned this into an epidemic. The constant feedback loop of posting and receiving has rewired how millions of people experience their own lives. They no longer have experiences for themselves. They have experiences to be shared. They no longer live moments. They capture them. They document them. They prepare them for public consumption. But the person who refuses to share photos, they've made a different calculation. They've decided that their experiences belong to them, that their face, their body, their private moments are not currency to be traded for attention, that their worth is not determined by how many people double-tap an image. This is not withdrawal. This is not fear. This is a form of psychological sovereignty that most people have forgotten is even possible. Let me take you deeper into what's really happening here. Because there's a specific psychological mechanism at work, and once you see it, you'll understand why this refusal is actually a sign of profound self-awareness. In the 1950s, psychologist Leon Festinger introduced a concept called social comparison theory. The basic idea is simple but devastating. Humans constantly evaluate themselves by comparing themselves to others. We look at what other people have, what they look like, what they're doing, and we measure our own worth against that standard. Social media has turned this natural human tendency into a weapon of mass psychological destruction. Every time you scroll through your feed, you're being exposed to hundreds of curated images of other people's highlight reels, their best angles, their most flattering moments. They're carefully constructed representations of success, beauty, happiness, and achievement. And your brain, which evolved to make social comparisons in small tribal groups where you knew everyone's full story, is now being overwhelmed by impossible standards. You're comparing your behind-the-scenes reality to everyone else's polished performance, and you're losing. Everyone is losing. The person who refuses to share photos understands this game is rigged. They've recognized that participating in this visual economy means subjecting themselves to constant comparison, constant evaluation, constant judgment, and they've made a radical choice. They've opted out. But here's what makes this even more interesting. Their refusal does something else, something most people don't consciously realize. By not sharing images of themselves, they disrupt the entire mechanism of digital social hierarchy. They become unreadable. They become mysterious. They refuse to be categorized, judged, or placed in the visual hierarchy that social media creates. Think about what happens when you encounter someone's profile and there's no photo. Your brain does something fascinating. It fills in the blanks. It creates a narrative. It becomes curious. The absence of an image creates more psychological intrigue than the presence of 1,000 carefully posed selfies. This is power. This is the power of withholding, the power of privacy, the power of refusal in a culture that demands constant disclosure. Now let me show you the research that explains why this matters so much. Studies on social media usage have consistently found correlations between photo sharing frequency and measures of anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem. The more people share images of themselves, the more vulnerable they become to what psychologists call feedback-seeking behavior and appearance-based social comparison. One study published in the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology found that limiting social media use to 30 minutes per day led to significant reductions in loneliness and depression. But here's the critical detail. The reduction wasn't about consuming less content. It was about posting less. It was about breaking the cycle of seeking validation through shared images. The people who don't share photos have already broken this cycle. They've already discovered what the research is now confirming, that the act of constantly displaying yourself for public evaluation is psychologically corrosive. That the temporary hit of validation you get from likes and comments is exactly that, temporary, and it requires increasingly frequent doses to maintain the same effect. This is the psychology of addiction. This is how slot machines work. Variable reward schedules. Sometimes you post and get a flood of engagement. Sometimes you post and get crickets. And that unpredictability keeps you coming back, keeps you posting, keeps you seeking that next hit of validation. The person who refuses to share photos has recognized this mechanism and chosen to step away from the machine. They've decided that their sense of self-worth will not be determined by the variable reward schedule of social media engagement. But there's another layer here, something even more profound. And this is where we need to talk about identity itself. Psychologist Erik Erikson spent decades studying how people form their sense of self. He understood that identity development is a complex process that requires experimentation, failure, privacy, and time. You need space to try on different versions of yourself. You need freedom to make mistakes without permanent record. You need the ability to change your mind, to evolve, to become someone different than you were yesterday. Social media destroys this process. Every photo you share becomes part of your permanent digital identity. Every image is archived, searchable, permanent. Your past selves are always available for public review. Your evolution is documented and frozen. You can never fully escape who you were because it's all there in the feed forever. The person who doesn't share photos has preserved something essential: the right to privacy and their own development, the right to change without documentation, the right to exist without creating a permanent, searchable public record of every stage of their evolution. This is not about hiding. This is about protecting the psychological space needed for genuine growth. This is about understanding that true identity development requires privacy, that you cannot become who you're meant to be while constantly performing for an audience. And here's where it gets really interesting, because the culture has started to pathologize this choice. People who don't share photos are often labeled as suspicious, antisocial, or hiding something. There's an assumption that participation in digital visibility is mandatory, that refusal is abnormal. But this assumption reveals something disturbing about our current moment. It reveals that we've collectively accepted a new social contract, the contract of mandatory self-disclosure, the contract that says your privacy is suspicious, that invisibility is antisocial, that if you have nothing to hide, you should have nothing to keep private. This is not just wrong. This is psychologically dangerous. Because privacy is not about having something to hide. Privacy is about having a self that exists independent of public observation. Privacy is about maintaining boundaries. Privacy is about preserving the psychological space needed for authentic selfhood. The people who refuse to share photos are not antisocial. They're not hiding. They're engaging in what psychologist Irving Goffman called backstage behavior. They're preserving a version of themselves that exists outside of public performance. They're maintaining what sociologist Charles Horton Cooley called the looking-glass self, the private self that exists independent of how others perceive you. This is essential. This is needed. This is what allows you to remain psychologically whole in an age that wants to fragment you into consumable images. Let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out. Imagine two people at the same event, experiencing the same beautiful sunset. The first person immediately pulls out their phone, spends 5 minutes trying to capture the perfect shot, filters it, writes a caption, posts it, and then spends the rest of the evening checking to see how many people engage with the image. The second person simply watches the sunset, feels it, experiences it fully, lets it exist as a private moment, unmediated, undocumented, unshared. Which person actually experienced the sunset? Which person was present? Which person's memory of that moment will be richer, more embodied, more real? The research on this is clear. Studies on what psychologists call media multitasking show that when you're documenting an experience for social media, you're not fully experiencing it. Your attention is divided. You're simultaneously living the moment and evaluating how it will play to an audience. You're performing the experience rather than having it. The person who doesn't share photos has reclaimed their full attention. They've chosen to be present rather than to perform presence. They've chosen to live their experiences rather than to document them for public consumption. This is what sovereignty looks like in the digital age. This is what it means to maintain psychological autonomy, when the entire culture is pushing you toward constant self-display. Now, I need to be clear about something. This is not an argument that everyone should stop sharing photos. This is not a moral judgment about people who enjoy social media. This is about understanding the psychological dynamics at play and recognizing that refusal is a valid, healthy, and increasingly necessary choice. Because here's the truth. We're living through a massive social experiment. We're the first generation to grow up with the ability to constantly broadcast our lives to hundreds or thousands of people. We're the first to experience the psychological impact of living under perpetual surveillance, even if that surveillance is voluntary. And we're just beginning to understand the costs. We're just starting to see the mental health crisis that comes from constant comparison, constant performance, constant evaluation. We're just starting to recognize that maybe, just maybe, not everything needs to be shared. That maybe some experiences are meant to remain private. That maybe your face, your body, your life are not products to be marketed to an audience. The people who refuse to share photos are the early adopters of this realization. They're the ones who've recognized that participation in the attention economy is optional. That you can exist fully and completely without constantly proving that existence through digital images. And this brings us to something crucial, the relationship between visibility and power. Because the culture tells us that visibility equals power, that if you're not seen, you don't matter. That influence requires exposure. That success means having a large audience. But this is a lie. This is a lie that benefits the platforms, the attention merchants, the people who profit from your constant self-display. Because the truth is exactly the opposite. In many ways, invisibility is power. When you're invisible, you're untrackable. When you're invisible, you're unpredictable. When you're invisible, you retain the element of surprise. When you're invisible, you can't be categorized, stereotyped, or reduced to a visual profile. History's most powerful operators have always understood this. They've understood that there's strength in being underestimated, that there's advantage in being unknown, that privacy is not weakness, it's strategy. The person who refuses to share photos has accessed this ancient wisdom in a digital context. They've recognized that in an age of total visibility, invisibility is the ultimate luxury. That in a world where everyone is performing, refusing to perform is the most radical act possible. Let me show you another dimension of this, because there's also something happening at the neurological level that explains why this refusal is so psychologically beneficial. Your brain has a system for processing self-relevant information. When you think about yourself, when you evaluate yourself, when you imagine how others perceive you, a specific network of brain regions becomes active. Neuroscientists call this the default mode network. Now here's what's fascinating. Excessive social media use, particularly photo sharing and feedback-seeking behavior, keeps this network in a state of hyperactivation. You're constantly thinking about yourself, constantly evaluating how you're being perceived, constantly monitoring your digital representation. This chronic self-focus is exhausting. It's psychologically draining. It prevents you from entering the kinds of mental states that lead to creativity, flow, deep connection, and genuine well-being. It keeps you trapped in a loop of self-consciousness that prevents authentic self-expression. The person who doesn't share photos has given their brain a break from this constant self-monitoring. They've freed up mental resources that would otherwise be spent on performance and evaluation. They've created psychological space for other, more meaningful forms of cognitive activity. This is why many of these people report feeling more present, more creative, more connected to their actual lives. It's not just psychological relief, it's neurological liberation. And here's another crucial insight. The refusal to share photos often correlates with what psychologists call intrinsic motivation. People who are intrinsically motivated do things for their own sake, for internal satisfaction, not for external rewards or validation. When you share photos on social media, you're often operating from extrinsic motivation. You're doing things because of how they'll look. You're choosing experiences based on their shareability. You're living for the audience rather than for yourself. The person who doesn't share photos has reclaimed their intrinsic motivation. They're free to have experiences, go places, look however they want without considering how it will play to an audience. Their choices are their own. Their life is their own. Their image is their own. This is psychological freedom. This is what it means to live from the inside out rather than from the outside in. Now let me address something that often comes up in this conversation. The accusation that people who don't share photos are somehow less social, less connected, less engaged with community. This is exactly backward. Research on social connection consistently shows that quality matters far more than quantity. Having 3 deep, authentic relationships is psychologically healthier than having 300 shallow, performative ones. Being truly known by a small circle is more meaningful than being superficially seen by thousands. The person who doesn't share photos has often made this trade consciously. They've chosen depth over breadth. They've chosen authenticity over performance. They've chosen to be fully present with the people in their actual lives, rather than maintaining a thin connection with a vast audience of acquaintances. This is not antisocial. This is selectively social. This is understanding that human connection requires presence, vulnerability, and time, none of which are possible when you're constantly performing for a digital audience. And there's something else here, something about attention itself. Because attention is finite, you only have so much of it. Every moment you spend managing your digital image is a moment you're not spending on something else. Every minute crafting the perfect post is a minute not spent reading, thinking, creating, connecting in real space with real people. The people who don't share photos have made a calculation about how they want to spend their attention. They've decided that their mental bandwidth is too valuable to be spent on the maintenance of a digital persona. They've chosen to invest their attention in things that actually matter to them, rather than in things that look like they matter to an audience. This is wisdom. This is what it means to be selective about where you direct your energy. This is understanding that in an attention economy, your attention is your most valuable asset, and giving it away cheaply is a form of self-betrayal. Let me take you even deeper into the mechanics of this, because there's a specific psychological vulnerability that photo sharing exploits, and understanding it will help you see why refusal is so powerful. Humans have what psychologists call a negativity bias. We're wired to pay more attention to negative information than positive information. This made sense in our evolutionary past, where ignoring a potential threat could get you killed. But in the context of social media, this bias becomes toxic. When you share a photo, you might get 99 positive responses and 1 negative one. And which one will your brain fixate on? The negative one. Every single time. That one person who didn't like the photo. That one ambiguous comment. That one friend who used to always engage but this time didn't. Your brain is scanning for social threats, and social media provides an endless stream of ambiguous signals that can be interpreted as rejection. The person who liked your last post but not this one. The friend who viewed your story but didn't respond. The engagement that's lower than your average. This keeps you in a state of low-grade anxiety. It keeps you monitoring, checking, seeking reassurance. It turns social media into a source of chronic psychological stress, disguised as connection. The person who refuses to share photos has opted out of this entire system. They've chosen not to expose themselves to the constant ambiguity, the constant potential for perceived rejection, the constant need to interpret social signals from people who may or may not actually care about them. This is self-protection. This is understanding that not every social space is psychologically safe, that some forms of connection are actually forms of exposure that leave you vulnerable to harm. And here's where we need to talk about something that often gets overlooked: the sheer emotional labor of maintaining a social media presence. Because sharing photos isn't just about taking and posting images. It's about managing your digital identity. It's about responding to comments. It's about maintaining relationships with people you might not even like. It's about performing engagement, performing gratitude, performing enthusiasm. This is work. This is unpaid psychological labor that you're doing for the benefit of platforms that profit from your engagement. And for what? For the illusion of connection? For a temporary hit of validation? For the fear that if you don't participate, you'll be forgotten? The person who doesn't share photos has recognized this as a bad trade. They've understood that their emotional energy is valuable, that their time is finite, that their psychological well-being matters more than maintaining a digital presence. This is not laziness. This is not antisocial behavior. This is a conscious choice about where to invest your limited emotional resources. This is understanding that you don't owe the world access to your image, your life, your private moments. Now I want to shift your perspective on something, because there's a narrative that people who don't share photos are somehow missing out, that they're not fully participating in modern life, that they're being left behind. But what if the opposite is true? What if the people who don't share photos are actually ahead? What if they've recognized something that the rest of us are just starting to understand? What if their refusal is not a retreat but an evolution? Because here's what's starting to happen. People are waking up to the costs of constant connectivity. They're recognizing that social media, as currently designed, is not making them happier, healthier, or more connected. They're starting to question whether the trade-off is worth it. And the people who never bought in, who never started sharing photos in the first place, they didn't have to go through the painful process of extraction. They didn't have to unlearn the addiction. They didn't have to delete years of digital history. They simply never entered the trap. This is prescience. This is understanding the game before you start playing. This is recognizing that the best way to win is not to play at all. Let me give you another framework for understanding this. In philosophy, there's a concept called negative freedom versus positive freedom. Negative freedom is freedom from constraint, freedom from interference. Positive freedom is freedom to do something, freedom to act. Most people think of social media as positive freedom, the freedom to share, to express, to connect. But what they don't see is the negative freedom that's lost. The freedom from surveillance, the freedom from judgment, the freedom from performance, the freedom from the constant pressure to prove your worth through digital validation. The person who doesn't share photos has preserved their negative freedom. They've protected their right to exist without documentation, without evaluation, without the constant gaze of an audience. And in our current moment, this negative freedom might be more valuable than any positive freedom that social media offers. Because here's the thing. You can always choose to start sharing photos. That door is always open. But once you've built a digital presence, once you've created a public persona, once you've accumulated years of shared images, it's much harder to go back. It's much harder to reclaim your privacy. It's much harder to return to invisibility. The people who never started have maintained their optionality. They've kept their choices open. They've preserved their ability to change course without the weight of digital history. This is strategic. This is smart. This is understanding that in an uncertain future, flexibility is more valuable than visibility. Now let me address one more aspect of this because it's crucial. The relationship between image sharing and authenticity. There's a paradox here that most people don't see. The more you share images of yourself, the less authentic you often become. Why? Because the act of sharing changes the experience itself. When you know you're going to post a photo, you start performing even before the camera comes out. You choose locations based on their photogenic qualities. You wear outfits that will look good in photos. You arrange your life for maximum visual impact. You start living for the image rather than for the experience. The photo becomes more important than the moment it's supposed to capture. Your life becomes a series of photo opportunities rather than a series of genuine experiences. The person who doesn't share photos has escaped this inversion. Their experiences remain authentic because they're not being filtered through the lens of shareability. They go places because they want to go there, not because it will look good on Instagram. They wear what they want, look how they want, do what they want without considering how it will appear to an audience. This is liberation. This is what it means to live authentically in an age of performance. This is choosing reality over representation. And here's the beautiful irony. The people who don't share photos often end up living more interesting lives than those who constantly document everything. Why? Because they're not constrained by what will look good. They're free to be weird, to experiment, to fail, to have private adventures that don't need to be validated by an audience. They're living for themselves. And that freedom produces a richness of experience that no amount of likes or followers can match. So what does all of this mean for you? What should you take from this understanding of why some people refuse to share photos on social media? First, recognize that this refusal is not abnormal. It's not antisocial. It's not suspicious. It's a valid, psychologically healthy choice that more and more people are making as they wake up to the costs of constant digital performance. Second, understand that if you feel exhausted by the demands of social media, if you feel like sharing photos has become a burden rather than a joy, you're not alone. You're experiencing a rational response to an irrational system. And you have the option to step back, to reduce, to stop entirely. Third, respect the boundaries of people who choose invisibility. Don't pressure them to share. Don't treat their privacy as suspicious. Don't make them feel like they're missing out or being antisocial. Understand that their choice is about self-preservation, about maintaining psychological sovereignty in a world that constantly demands disclosure. And fourth, consider what you might gain by sharing less. Consider what it might feel like to have experiences without documenting them. Consider what it might mean to exist without constantly performing your existence. Consider what freedom might be available to you if you stopped trading your privacy for validation. Because here's the ultimate truth. You don't owe anyone access to your image. You don't owe the internet proof that you exist. You don't owe the platforms your emotional labor, your attention, your private moments turned into public content. Your life is yours. Your face is yours. Your experiences are yours. And choosing to keep them private is not a retreat. It's a reclamation. It's a radical act of self-ownership in an age that wants to turn you into content. The people who refuse to share photos understand this. They've recognized that in a world of total visibility, privacy is power. That in an age of constant performance, authenticity requires boundaries. That in a culture of mandatory self-disclosure, refusal is a form of resistance. They're not hiding. They're not afraid. They're not antisocial. They're simply choosing to exist on their own terms, in their own time, in their own way, without the need to constantly prove or perform or display themselves for an audience that may or may not actually care. And maybe, just maybe, that's one of the sanest choices being made in our increasingly insane digital landscape. So the next time you encounter someone who doesn't share photos on social media, don't see it as absence. See it as presence. See it as someone who's chosen to be fully here rather than perpetually elsewhere. See it as someone who understands that the most powerful way to exist in an age of total visibility is to claim the right to remain unseen. This is the psychology behind the refusal. This is what's really happening beneath the surface. This is the needed truth that everyone should understand but most people miss. If this resonated with you, if this made you question your own relationship with social media, with photo sharing, with the constant pressure to document and display your life, then do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on digital privacy, on the pressure to be visible, on what you've gained or lost from social media. Because we're building something here. We're creating a space where these essential conversations can happen, where we can question the narratives we've been sold about connection, about community, about what it means to exist in a digital age. And if you want to go deeper, if you want to understand more about the psychology of social media, about attention, about how to maintain your sovereignty in an age that wants to fragment you into consumable content, then stick around, because there's so much more to explore. So many more truths that need to be told. So many more ways that understanding psychology can set you free from the invisible prisons we've built around ourselves. The choice is yours. But now, at least, you understand what that choice really means. You understand what the people who refuse to share photos have figured out. And you understand that their invisibility is not absence. It's a form of presence so powerful that it refuses to be reduced to an image. That's the truth. That's what needed to be said. And now you know.